You are listening to a Freedom Student Ministry podcast.
All right, let's pray for Jen and Tim.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, God, for this awesome power couple, and thank you so much for how much they love you, they love these students, and they love your word. And I just pray you would speak through them tonight and help us all, God, to understand what you want each of our hearts to hear tonight. And God, I just pray that this would be a powerful message and really helpful to us through your Spirit. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Since you're up here helping me, get Bibles. Where can I set stuff down? Should
Right here is fine.
So I wasn't here last week, but I know Erica started the series with kind of an introduction or an overview of the Bible itself. So since I wasn't here, I wonder if everybody remembers any unique things that she taught you all about the Bible. Anything at all? Yes, April.
That there is like different Bibles, like there's NIV, there is the pastor one.
Different translations, yeah.
Yeah, there's like you said.
And why do you think there are different translations?
Because sometimes we don't need to know the meaning, and we can go like to the pastor one and see like the meaning or see what.
Well, then the original Bible wasn't written in English either, so it had to be translated, and there's different ways to translate into English. So, yeah, so there are different translations with, and they help if you read different literal versus more paraphrased translations. But just for a quick overview again, I know she hit this last week, but the Bible is very unique literature. It's not like any other kind of book we've read before. And part of the reason is it's not one book. I mean, the Bible's 66 different books, although we treat it like one book, 66 different books, 40 different authors, written over 1,500 years in 3 different languages. So it's very unique, very different than anything we've ever read before. And it's not like other religious books, because the Bible, since it's a collection of all these writings by different authors, all with a central theme of God moving through history. If you think about like the writings of Muhammad, the Quran, that's only Muhammad's writings and his teachings, or the book of Buddha. That's just Buddha's writings. And so Jesus never wrote anything. Everything in the Bible has been recorded by others. So it's unique in that way. And because it contains 66 different books, we can't just pick it up and try to read it like a novel. I mean, you can try to pick it up and read it like a novel. I think a lot of us, when we first approach the Bible, that may be what we've done. And we start out with Genesis and Exodus, and it kind of reads like a history or something, and then you get bogged down in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. And so we got to look at the Bible a little bit differently. Because it's 66 books, it's not arranged necessarily chronological. It's arranged in sections, so it's more like a newspaper. I know we don't read newspapers anymore because we're in the electronic age, but in the newspaper, you have a business section and the obituaries and the comic section. And each section, it's divided up that way, and each one you kind of look a little differently. You don't read the obituaries like you read the comics. So you kind of have to know what you're reading before you pick up that that particular section of the Bible. So the Bible has 2 main divisions, and the Old Testament and the New Testament. Does anybody know what Testament means? So it's really the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. So the Old Covenant that God made with Abraham and with the Jewish people, and the New Covenant He made with us Christians through Jesus Christ. So in the Old Testament, this is the 1-minute version of the Old Testament. God chose one man, Abraham, said, I'm going to make a covenant with you, I'm going to bless you and your descendants, and his descendants became the Jewish people. He gave them a land and a blessing and grew them, and then the rest of the whole history just gave the history of the Jews and how God interacted with the Jews, and gave them a law to follow, and when they broke the law, He disciplined them and brought them back. When they followed the law, He blessed them. So that was the Old Testament. Then in the New Testament, God sends his promised Messiah, Jesus, and to set up a new covenant with us Christians. It's not just a covenant with the Jews, but it's a covenant with everybody. And it's not dependent on following a list of rules like the old law that Moses gave. It relies solely on God's grace and just his free gift to us. So that's a quick synopsis of the Old Testament and New Testament. Tonight, I'm going to do kind of an overview of the Old Testament. Next week, we're going to cover the New Testament. So, Old Testament, if y'all have a Bible, so in the very early pages, I got it right there.
Okay, good.
You got to flip like 8 pages in. You find this. It's kind of like a table of contents. Right in the front. Since I didn't bring a handout for everybody, I want to. So it says the guide to the books of the Holy Bible. Do you see that? And then it says Israel's covenant history, Israel's wisdom and songs. Okay. So this just help as a guide because the Old Testament is really divided up into 4 sections. They have it 3 sections here. But under Israel's covenant history, there's really 2 sections. The first section is called the Law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's all written by Moses. The rest of those books are all books of history. So you have the Law, history, and then it says Israel's wisdom and songs. And those are kind of the wisdom books or the books of poetry. And then Israel's prophets. And there's 16 books that are all prophets. And that is the 4 sections of the Old Testament. So I'm going to go through each of those 4 sections. First is the Law, and the Jews call it the Torah. In fact, the Jews hold the Torah in very high regard. They keep it on a scroll. It goes in a locked box in their synagogues. And it's the books that were written by Moses. And they describe creation, the calling of Abraham, the captivity in Egypt, and then the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, called the Exodus, and then God giving the law. And in the law, the Torah is where we find the origins of the covenant God made with Abraham and the Jewish people. So I wanted to hit those real quick. So in your Bibles, if you turn to Genesis 12, and Genesis is the very first book. So in the first book, in the 12th chapter, is where God makes his first covenant promise. So, Jen, since you're assisting me,
Yes.
read verses 1 through 3 of Genesis chapter 12.
12, 1 through 3.
Yep.
The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people on earth will be blessed through you."
Okay, so this is the first part of the Abrahamic covenant that God made with Abraham. So what did God promise to do? What were some of the things God promised he would do with Abraham? Yeah, April.
That he will bless you, and whoever curses you, he will curse them.
Okay, so all the descendants of Abraham will have that blessing. When people curse them, they'll be cursed. So they'll be a very, very great and very blessed nation. Okay? And all the people on the earth will be blessed through you, which is actually kind of this foreshadowing of the coming Messiah. And there's kind of a second half to the covenant God made with Abraham. So if you flip back a couple pages to Genesis 15, verses 18 through 21. And this is another portion where God is kind of sealing this covenant with Abraham. He has Abraham cut these animals in half, and he walks between them, and then God walks between them and makes this covenant promise. So Jen, can you read 18 through 21?
Chapter 15, 18 through 21. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites."
So, in the second,
read it fast.
yeah. So in the second half of the covenant, what did God promise Abraham? and his descendants. Yes?
Land.
Land, which is the land they're in right now. So there are two parts of the Abrahamic covenant. There's the blessing that God's people, the Jews, would be blessed. And the second part, they were promised that land. That's why it's called the promised land, because God promised it to them. And so, this is the beginning of the Old Covenant. The Old Testament is God's covenant promise with Abraham. And basically everything that follows in the Old Testament is based on these promises he set with Abraham back here in Genesis. So I'm still kind of covering those first 5 books of the law. The second big thing that happens in those first 5 books happens in Exodus 20. In fact, let's turn there. We won't read the verses, but turn to Exodus 20 and tell me what you find there.
So that's page 68.
So Exodus is the second book in the Old Testament. You may even have a heading in your Bible for that chapter. I'm not sure.
Page 68.
I don't think this Bible.
Oh, it
gives
doesn't have a
headings.
heading.
I
Okay.
think it's just so condensed.
Okay.
It should look familiar though.
If you read the first few verses, it should kind of stand out to you what that is. You should not make for yourself any graven images. You should not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day. Do those things sound familiar?
Yeah.
Like kind of like the Ten Commandments. Charlton Heston. So Moses, led the people of Israel from Egypt. They're going to the Promised Land. On the way, they stop at Mount Sinai, and God gives them. It's kind of like an amendment to the Abrahamic covenant. It's the Mosaic covenant. God gives them this law to follow. And God says, follow this law. And the Ten Commandments is just like the first portion of the law. There's a lot more that follows. But he says to the Jews, follow this law, and I will continue to bless you in keeping the land. If you don't follow the law, bad things are going to happen. You'll get moved out of the land. So it's kind of like an amendment to the Abrahamic covenant. Here's what you need to do to maintain my blessing on you. And along with it came this whole system of sacrifices and a tabernacle where they could offer sacrifices. And so if they did sin, if they did mess up, they had a way for these sacrifices to atone for that. Mm-hmm. Okay, so all that occurs there in the first 5 books, the law, in the Old Testament. The second major section, if you were looking back at this beginning of your Bible, is called history. And this is a part of the Old Testament I think is the easiest for us to read, because it reads like chronological history of the people of Israel. And has many of the stories, if you guys all went to Sunday school, you probably heard in Sunday school. So can anybody think of some stories they remember from Sunday school? Particular people or events you remember?
David and Goliath.
David and Goliath. That comes from these history books. What? Moses.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Noah's Ark.
Noah's Ark. Actually, Moses and Noah are back in the law, but they're still historical parts of the law. Yeah.
Good try, Dee.
No. I'm saying those are all answers to what you were taught in Sunday school.
Sunday school.
Yeah. But stories like
David.
David and King Saul and Samson and Ruth and all those things. All those stories came out of this historical part of the Old Testament. So in these books, it shows how God's fulfilling his covenant promises with the people of Israel. It shows them coming to the Promised Land, capturing the Promised Land, living there, and then this whole series of kings and what happens when the kings and the people followed the law and what happened when they didn't, and how they would be taken off captive to Assyria or taken off captive to Babylon when they didn't follow the law. But the one thing we learn about God's character in all this is even when the people were behaving as badly as they could, God never gave up or abandoned his people. He still restored them. They were captive in Babylon for 70 years. He brought them back to Israel. He never totally gave them up, and which gives me confidence too, because God's character doesn't change. God still has the same character with his new covenant with us as Christians. He's not going to abandon us. Okay, third section of the Bible is this thing in here. It's called Israel's Wisdom and Songs. So really, it's books of, I would say, poetry, but Jewish poetry or that old Hebrew poetry isn't like what we're used to with things that rhyme. The way they wrote their poetry. They would make a statement and then do another statement that was usually like a synonym, the same kind of thing restated, or an opposite. And you have books of wisdom which talk about the value of making godly choices. And so really Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, I think could all be considered wisdom. Then you have the book of Psalms, which is also written in Hebrew poetry, but it's really a book for singing. It's a book of songs. So I want to look at a couple of examples to see some of this Hebrew poetry. So we'll start with a book of wisdom, Proverbs. Proverbs is all books of Proverbs. So Proverbs chapter 3, which I have got on page 567.
567.
So this is a good example of some Proverbs, some books of wisdom, and you see how the poetry works. If someone is willing, I'm looking for someone to read verses 5 through 8 of Proverbs chapter 3.
5 through 8.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones.
Okay, so this is a good example of a proverb or wisdom literature. You kind of hear the repetition, like those first couple of verses. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. In all your ways submit to him, and he'll make your path straight. It's kind of like it just restates the same thing. So that's an example of some of the wisdom literature. And then a good example of a psalm and some of that poetry. Just turn to Psalm chapter 2. Psalm chapter 2 is on page 482. 482.
But look for 483 because 482 isn't written
Found
at the
it.
top of the page.
All right. And I'm just going to read a few verses, and so just listen to. So this is written as a song, but it's written in that Hebrew style of poetry. And it says, "Why do the nations conspire and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in the heaven laughs, and the Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying," anyway, you hear kind of that, the themes repeated on each verse. So that's how Hebrew poetry is written. And so when you pick up one of these poetry books or wisdom books, you got to realize, why does this read kind of funny? Well, because it's written in this Hebrew poetic form. It's not written like a historical book. So it's a little trickier to read. You have to understand kind of the purpose behind it. And the last section of the Old Testament is called the prophets. And I would say, of any part of the Old Testament, this may be the most difficult to read. So there's 16 books of prophecy, and they were, even though they're at the very end of the Old Testament, they were all written during the same time as the historical books. They're just lumped together separately. And most of the time when we think about prophecy, we're thinking about future events. 99% of what the prophets had to say was about Israel's immediate future at that time, not about something way in the future. Because that really didn't help his audience if he's talking about something that's happening 2,000 years later. Most of it was focused on what the people needed to do then. So the prophets acted as God's mouthpiece, and they would remind the people of the covenant promises they had made and their ancestors had made, and what would happen if they didn't follow those promises. And so most of the prophets you'll read are these statements of prophecy to the people they're talking to. Sometimes the southern half of Judah, sometimes it's northern Israel. But sometimes you'll see in the prophecies, God calls them to act out stuff too. Ezekiel especially, he had to lay on his side for so many days and lay on his left side for another so many days, looking at an iron pot. This is all representing what God is doing. And one time God had him dig through a hole in the wall to show the people, or the king of Jerusalem, that was going to dig out a hole in the wall and try to flee the invading Babylon army. So it was kind of unique ways God used to get his point across to his people. So those are the four parts of the Old Testament: the law, history, poetry, and the prophets. Now, kind of some recommendations or conclusions. So if you're a new Christian or new to reading the Bible, I would not recommend starting by reading the Old Testament. If you're a new Christian, start in the New Testament. Understand what God did through His Son Jesus, in the new covenant we have. Start there first, because you can very easily get bogged down and confused in the Old Testament. So I'd understand the New Testament first, and then go back to the Old Testament, because it gives us good context for kind of the sacrificial system and the Jewish background. And then when you do read the Old Testament, go read something like the historical books first, so you get an understanding of the history of the Jewish people. Don't pick up like Isaiah or one of the big prophets, because that will just be, it's still confusing to me now. So it's very difficult to understand. So I would start with the history and understand God's movement through His people, the Jews. And then finally, I think for the conclusion of the Old Testament, and I had stated this earlier, how God dealt with Israel in the Old Testament is very similar to how He deals with us Christians and how He dealt with Christians in the New Testament. He is the same character. So no matter how much they screwed up, He never abandoned them. So that's good to remember. And then the whole sacrificial system He established with the Mosaic covenant set the stage for Jesus coming as a sacrifice to us. So people at the time very much understood the meaning of sacrifices and atonement for sin. So it all made sense when Jesus came. So hopefully, before any questions? I just want to give you guys a broad brush, because I think it's important for us all to be reading the Bible, but I think it's important also to understand what it is we're looking at when we pick it up. So next week we'll dive into the New Testament, kind of talk about how that's organized, and then the final lesson Ethan's going to talk about is how to start your own reading plan and that kind of thing, and why that's important.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Could each of you share maybe right now what your favorite story is or your favorite theme is of the Old Testament?
Okay. So one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament is Nehemiah. So Nehemiah is one of the historical books, but it's very short. And Nehemiah, because Nehemiah was kind of an engineer, he was called to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem after they'd been destroyed. So that's, I always kind of like Nehemiah. It's very relatable. Yeah.
I love the story of Esther. And it's the only book in the Old Testament that doesn't use the name God. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther.
It's true.
But yet, providence and Esther was in just the right place at the right time in her life, the right status and position, and for just a time as this.
Esther's another short historical book it's a pretty intense drama, because the Jews are about to be totally annihilated except for Esther. Yeah, it's like the original Holocaust. Yeah, that's
So, like that ministers to you guys, because why are you in your school? Why are you on that bus? Why are you for just a time as
right.
this?
Her uncle, he said, who knows that for such a time as this you were put in this place.
Yeah.
Any other adults in the room want to share their favorite?
I don't have favorite, but I think the ones I absolutely love is when Abraham is debating with God about how many people to save in the city that God will destroy. It's such a window into God's deep longing to be won by His kids. Because people would say, well, God already knew what Abraham was going to say, so why did God entertain the discussion? But it's because God wanted to draw out the dialogue from Abraham. And God originally was going to destroy the entire city because it was the most terrible city on earth. But Abraham's like, well, what if there's 50 people who love you in the city? And he's like, fine, for 50 people I'll save the city. And then he goes on, he's like, since I've been so foolish as to debate with the Lord, what if for 40 people?
Right.
It's like, fine, for 40. Lord, would you please bear my request one more time? What about 30?
Yeah.
Fine. What about 10? Fine. What about 5? He's like, for 5, I will not save the city, but I will ensure that they will live. It's just so cool, you know? Like, oftentimes people approach God with fear, but perhaps too much cowering. Like they think that he doesn't want to be approached, but he does.
And he's, yeah, the New Testament says he's not one that any should perish. He's long suffering, so he doesn't, he doesn't want to have to bring judgment.
Yeah.
He wants, yeah.
I really like the story of Ruth. I feel like a lot of people focus on the end, the whole like Boaz part, but I really like the beginning because she chose to go with her mother-in-law Naomi, expecting nothing in return, and that's something that I'm really working on right now. So that story is really impactful for me. Like she went just because she loved her and wanted to serve her, like expecting nothing else back. I feel like so.
Kellen, do you want to share anything?
I like Ecclesiastes.
Really? That's one of those wisdom books, but it's got a neat point to it.
Everyone always like talks about Proverbs regarding like, the wisdom of Solomon. Ecclesiastes is so much different than some Proverbs. There's still so much wisdom in it.
Well, I agree with you. I think Ecclesiastes is a lot easier to read than Proverbs too.
I think it sounds like a cliche answer, but Psalms has been really important for me in this season. Just reading, just for one, being encouraged that someone in Bible times went through what I've been going through and understands and understood. Just he had deep lows and high highs, and so I can read those as prayers and as encouragement. And also just I love how at the end of most of the Psalms, he ends his Psalms after he said, this sucks and this is terrible and I feel this way, and he always says, but God is still good, he's faithful. He always says a true